Center en Washington, D.C. Y de su formación académica es candidato, es PhD Candidate in Political Science de la Universidad de Toronto, Máster en Teoría Política de la Universidad de Toronto y licenciado en Relaciones Internacionales de York University. Asimismo es Senior Fellow de SESCOS y agradecemos especialmente a SESCOS por esta actividad que estamos organizando en conjunto. También agradecemos al señor embajador de la República Oriental del Uruguay en Lima, Perú, por acompañarnos, el doctor Luis Hierro López, por acompañarnos en este mediodía con nosotros. Just before we start, I'm going to remind everyone that this conference will be held in English. If you have any questions during the conference, you may be free to write it down on the chat, but at the end, we are going to have some space for your questions and comments. So, Nicolás, we are very happy to have you here. Please, you are among friends, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Gracias a todos por asistir a la conferencia. Sí, presentación va a ser en inglés, pero por supuesto yo puedo responder a las preguntas en español o inglés. So I'll start in English now. So yes, just a little bit background of who I am. Originally, I was born in Uruguay, and I grew up in Toronto, Canada. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in political science, and my dissertation is actually on Uruguay and Argentina, comparing their labor relations. And I'm about to defend, so that's good news. On top of that, I was a former senior researcher at the Wilson Center Latin American program here and Argentina project. That's where I met Pedro, and I joined SESCOS as a senior fellow. And then in November of last year, I joined the Economist Intelligence Unit, where I am an analyst of Latin America and the Caribbean, sorry. And the countries in which I actually cover include Peru, Chile, Uruguay, Suriname, and the Cayman Islands. So if you want to know more about the Cayman Islands, let me know. But I'll start the presentation now. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? I hope you can. Let's see. 1 second. Okay, so Perú, una democracia en la encrucijada, or Peru, a democracy at the crossroads. I think all of you know what's going on in Peru more or less. That before really the election. So that was the one surprise. The second surprise was Keiko Fujimori and how she was actually able to consolidate support behind her candidacy against other outsider candidates on the right. So on the right, you had Rafael Lopez Aliaga, the Renovación Popular, which is a far-right political party with strong basis in the evangelical movement. And then you had the neoliberal free market right that was represented by Hernando de Soto and his Avanza País. But because the right was so divided, Keiko Fujimori had enough political support to make up the difference between the two of them and become the candidate for the right in Peru. So this is the surprising element of the Peruvian election. It's not surprising that the country's politics looks like this. So I think this slide shows the geographic division in political terms. I think it's very important, especially to look at the 2006 map and the 2021 map. They're actually very similar. The 2006 election is interesting because that election, you had Ollanta Humala, who was seen by many to be an outsider to politics, but on top of that, a Castillo-like character. At the time, he was, a left-wing candidate. He was seen as very close to Hugo Chavez and Chavismo. And he was promoting statist economic policies, populist policies that Pedro Castillo also promoted. And if you actually look at the map, you see that the deep underlying division between cosmopolitan Peru, right, that is integrated into the global economy. So that is, the coastal region, and you have the Peru profundo, right, the interior, which hasn't benefited so much from global integration. And in 2006 and 2021, they look almost the same. That basically, fundamentally, nothing has really changed. Now, a good example of this actually is that the provinces, so Peru has regions, right? The political divisions you see here are regions. Within those regions are provinces or provincias. And there in provincias where you have large mines, Pedro Castillo got about 90% of the vote. So that strongly suggests that there's a serious disconnect between the extractive institutions and political representation in Peru, which has generated this long-standing political instability in the country. It also highlights something else. I think it's important that Peru is an ethnically diverse society, and what Castillo, like Humala, represented was embodied the identity of people from the interior. He wasn't, a white elite from Lima. He was, from Chota. He was from the interior of Peru, one of the poorest regions of Peru. And he sounded and he looked like and he spoke like the people of the interior of the country. And Humala was similar in that vein. And so it's not just a division of the extractive institutions that has created, but this is also overlapping into longstanding cultural divisions within the country. Now, if you go to 2011 here, you'll see that in the next election, Humala ran against Keiko Fujimori. And there, Humala moderated his message. And so he was able to reduce the fears of a radical left party, coming to power. And he crushed, in terms of the regional distribution, he was able to win regions that were, otherwise pro-globalization, et cetera, right? And he won the election there in the second round. So moderating his stance, he was able to make serious advances. Keiko Fujimori lost that election. That was her first election that she ran in. And she ran again in 2016. And this one's actually, this is when the contemporary political crisis of Peru began. So in that election, Keiko Fujimori went up against Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who was also a, center-right candidate who was also in favor of generally the same policies Keiko was in favor of, free markets, open trade, things of that nature, basically defending the legacy of Fujimorismo, but he was more democratic, let's say, than Keiko's legacy. Keiko has a controversial legacy with democracy, as I think we all now know, and her relationship with liberal elements of democracy. Pedro offered a different alternative of similar economic policies, but with a more liberal political stance. And he barely won. As Peru observers probably know, that election between Keiko and Pedro and PPK, which he'll be named from now on, was narrow could be. It was even narrower than the election of 21 between Castillo and Keiko, but barely, right? We're talking 0.2% of the vote. But he won. And one of the reasons he won is actually because at the last moment, Veronica Mendoza of a left-wing party actually threw her weight behind PPK to stop Keiko from winning. And that allowed him to consolidate the vote in the South, as you can see here in the purple, which was enough to allow him to win. This initiated a period of political instability. Fujimori was actually slighted by, this was a personal loss. She was slighted by this. She was angry. And what she did in the next 3 or 4 years was actually very consequential. She would use her large legislative majority in the Congress to try to undermine the PPK administration as much as humanly possible. She did not want to give him any room to govern. But Paula Munoz recently had an article in Journal Democracy, which I strongly suggest everyone read. It was actually free. You can download it. She put it this way, that Keiko Fujimori and Fuerza Popular, which is her party, Fuerza Popular, would, quote, use dormant and vague institutional rules that weaponized as the new administration and opposition faced off in a game of constitutional hardball that tested the institutions of Peruvian democracy to their limits. So what Keiko did and her party did is that they have a strong awareness of how to use the institutions of the Constitution, a Constitution that was created by her father, Alberto Fujimori, when he was president/dictator in the 1990s. They used all means in that Constitution to undermine the presidency of PPK. And well, what happened? Well, what's interesting is that, in 2016, Fuerza Popular under Keiko Fujimori had a massive majority. So I'm just going to highlight this here. It had a massive majority. It had over 70 seats in the Congress, which allowed them to do basically almost anything they wanted. They didn't have 2/3 of the seats. If they had 2/3 of the seats, they really could have done a lot of damage. They would have basically have run the country to a large extent, but they didn't get that far. But they got enough where they created serious problems for governability. Now, I think from a political science perspective, this is an interesting opportunity to talk about a lost opportunity for Peru, I think. So with such a large majority in Congress, Keiko Fujimori was actually quite popular at the time. This was before the corruption scandals really exploded and undermined her popularity with the public. This was an opportunity actually for Keiko Fujimori and the Fuerza Popular to create a legitimate party. Peru is known for having very weak party system, and she could have, if she had wanted to, I think, created a constructive but still oppositional position to the PPK administration, but from a policy perspective that I think would have been valued by a great number of Peruvians. But she didn't do that. She used the party basically as a personal vehicle to exact revenge on the PPK administration. And this was a lost opportunity, I think, really for Peru. So the crisis got much worse with the explosion of the Odebrecht scandal in 2016, late 2016. Now, the Fuerza Popular and Keiko Fujimori already tried to impeach PPK already on corruption charges, but in December 2017. However, with that impeachment process that they initiated, which had failed, by the way, because again, you need 2/3, it came at the cost of them losing support within their own party. And one of the most important instances of this was Keiko Fujimori, which is Kenji Fujimori, sorry, he left Fuerza Popular and created his own political organization outside of the party. And so the failure of the first impeachment began to see Fuerza Popular lose a lot of its political power. Now, under threat of a second impeachment, the Fuerza Popular actually released video recordings that showed a lawyer of PPK negotiating with Kenji and other legislators to vote against the first impeachment, right, in return for some, corrupt vote buying, right? So if you vote against this, I'll give you that. Obviously, this was incontrovertible evidence, and PPK resigned in March 2018. And so Keiko had actually succeeded in her goal of getting rid of PPK. Now, what happened was that Martin Vizcarra, who was the ambassador of Peru to Canada actually at the time, came back to Peru and became the president of Peru. He was going to finish PPK's term. Now, I want to emphasize here, looking at this distribution of the parties, by 2019, you can already see that there's a massive fragmentation of the political system, that Fuerza Popular had basically failed to consolidate as a party, that her attempts to get rid of PPK was controversial, and the manipulation or the use of the Constitution for political ends was not supported by everybody. And so this opportunity was basically eroded. And by 2019, the majority that Keiko had was gone, right? So she no longer had the political majority. She still had the largest share of votes in the party, in the Congress, sorry, but she didn't have the power she once did. So despite this, Keiko Fujimori and her allies were still very much against the Vizcarra presidency. They also tried to undermine his presidency as best as they could. And Vizcarra, in response to this, he launched a anti-corruption drive. He started proposing a lot of institutional reforms, constitutional reforms including, that would try to tackle the long-term problem of institutionalized corruption in Peru. But this was not popular, obviously, with people in the Congress who were threatened by these reforms. The thing is that Vizcarra's attempt to do this was actually quite popular with the public. So he became, it became actually very complicated for the opposition, because by opposing him and his anti-corruption reforms, they actually emboldened him. And in December 2018, Vizcarra actually passed a number of political reforms that he saw that were necessary to reduce political corruption in the country and increase the ability of the country to have a more stable political system. And again, the population voted overwhelmingly in favor of 3 of the 4 reforms. They rejected one, which was to create a Senate, because in Peru, I should clarify, only has one camera, right? One Congress. It doesn't have a Senate. So it's just the Congress and the president, which makes things really conflictual. It's a semi-parliamentary system, you can call it. So what he wanted to do was create a Senate to create a buffer between the two, and the population overwhelmingly rejected that. But other things the population voted overwhelmingly in favor of included campaign finance reform. And one thing that they also approved, which is actually, I think, damaging in the long run, probably for governability, was that they voted to deny consecutive re-election for members of Congress. This is probably a bad thing, because what that would do is that it would actually reduce the incentives for Congress people to learn how to do the job. It would also reduce institutional memory. So, but it was popular, Congress people at the time were very unpopular. It was understandable, but this is, I think, a warning of, taking contemporary political sentiments and then hardwiring it into a constitution. I think that's something that, for example, if a Chilean constitutional reform right now is something that should be very much a warning sign, right, of taking contemporary political issues and hardwiring into a constitution. Same thing for Peru. If Peru tries to do a constitutional reform, which is what Castillo wants to do, it could have very long-term consequences that are unforeseen or unexpected. And so it's very, very important to get that right. Nevertheless, the reforms passed. But Congress did not want to cooperate with Vizcarra. And so they still were putting up obstacles to his reforms. And the breaking point occurred when the Congress tried to appoint 6 new constitutional court judges. Now, Vizcarra opposed this for a number of reasons. The point is that he opposed the appointments. And he considered this to be, by the Congress defying him, he considered a vote of no confidence in his government. Now, the reason why this matters is because the Congress voted against the PPK administration, given a vote of no confidence when PPK was president. Vizcarra now got a second vote of no confidence in his government from the Congress. According to the Peruvian constitution, if you have 2 votes of no confidence in the government can dissolve the Congress and call for new elections. And so what Vizcarra thought at the time was, okay, well, this is a dysfunctional Congress, and Fuerza Popular is too strong. I can't get anything through. So I'm going to close the Congress down. This is totally legal, and initiate a new election for a new Congress. And he did this in September 2019. On January 26, 2020, Peruvians elected a new Congress, and here you see it in the third here, which fragmented the political scene further, arguably, right, to some degree. It went from 12 parties to 9, but the 9 parties were highly fragmented ideologically. They were a lot of newcomers, like FEPAP, for example. FEPAP is a centrist party. It's hard to define ideologically, but it's an evangelical party that emerged out of nowhere. So it's an example of the emergence of outsiders, right, in Peruvian politics. But what's notable here is that Fuerza Popular still existed, but it became a very small party. So you went from a huge majority to this in 4 years. And that also tracked well with what was happening with Keiko Fujimori, who in 2018 was put under house arrest because she was under investigation for large-scale corruption related to her 2011 and 2016 campaign. This was also, ironically enough, related to the Odebrecht scandal. So her popularity tanked. She just lost a lot of popularity as a result of this. And you can see that in the results of her party in the 2020 election. So this opportunity, like I said, to create a party system in Peru failed completely. It wasn't even attempted, arguably, right? But this opportunity had just disappeared. So the problem with Vizcarra himself was that he did this. He called for a new constitution, a new Congress, a new election, but he didn't actually have a party. He himself didn't propose, he didn't get any kind of legislative support, right? Which is just asking for trouble. So he didn't actually have any legislative party behind him. And so he was completely at the whim of the parties in the Congress. And what made it worse for him was that he no longer had the tools that he used before to get the Congress to do what he wanted. For example, the ability to call a no confidence vote to have a new congressional election. Without that tool, he basically had lost the momentum actually with Congress. So it actually backfired on him, this election. And what it meant was that the Congress, unlike the presidency, can call, can do an impeachment whenever it wants, right? It doesn't have a limit as to the number of impeachments it can do. And this is something that I think, as we all probably now can see, was something that Vizcarra, unfortunately, probably didn't really think through very clearly. He thought that his popularity would be enough to get him through. But it was actually his popularity to some degree that was the problem, because he could actually get things through, ironically enough, so you can flip it around. So what does it mean? And I'm just going to quickly go here to 2021. This is the actual composition of the next Congress. And you can see that Fuerza Popular had has increased its number of seats. It's no longer as small as it was. I think it's doubled its number of seats, but it's still much smaller than it was. And you can see here that the center right, the right actually, is still smaller than it was here in 2016. Nevertheless, these parties here are very much aligned with Keiko Fujimori ideologically. On this here, you can see on this red is Perú Libre, which is Pedro Castillo's party. And then in these green dots is Juntos por el Perú, which is the party of Veronica Mendoza, who is in a coalition with Perú Libre. So you see that the Congress is basically divided into thirds. So you have 1/3 on the left, 1/3 on the right, and then 1/3 on the middle in the center. And these votes here can go either way ultimately. So that's a political landscape as it is. But what the main message I'm trying to get across here is that we see a progressive party collapse. The question I think here is whether or not Perú Libre can actually become a party is sustainable over time. This is a big question mark, and I don't know the answer to it. And we'll get to that later. Another thing I wanted to highlight here is that associated with the party collapse and associated with Keiko Fujimori's and the attempts to undermine the government of PPK and Vizcarra was an increase in political polarization in the country. And I use Argentina as a baseline because Argentina, as I think everybody probably knows, is a highly polarized society. But here, what's interesting is that Peru, was highly polarized under, when Fujimori was ousted from power. And then it was fairly fine. And then 2016 happened and boom, you can see that there was this huge polarization in Chile and Peruvian society. This is from VDEM, by the way. And this polarization obviously has persisted to the present, has gotten worse. So the processes that were present, since 2016 have only become even worse in the present period. So let's get back to Vizcarra. So ¿quién manda, right? Who's in charge? This is a big question in Peru. Who actually runs the show? Is it the president or is it the Congress? And what's interesting about Vizcarra is that Vizcarra's popularity was always pretty high, actually. He was a very popular president, which is surprising given, that Peruvian presidents lose popularity. He was actually quite popular because he was pretty consistent in his attempts to reform Peru's institutions to make them less corrupt, which was seen as positive. And at the bottom here, you can see that Congress was never popular. The Congress was rejected by everyone. Basically, very few people thought the Congress was doing a good job. But there was a brief respite here after the election, the 2020 election. But again, they lost their popularity because they started again with the attempts to basically undermine Vizcarra's presidency. And Vizcarra, after the start of the COVID-19 crisis, over here you can see, he became very popular and remained popular actually until his impeachment in November 2020. So this was really interesting that I think it's important to note from a political science perspective, it's kind of strange that a popular president would be impeached. That's very unusual. But that shows how the Peruvian political system works, actually, that popular presidents are actually threatening potentially to the Congress and its interests. So, una bomba de tiempo, right? You have the bomb in the Constitution. What's the bomb? Well, in Article 113 of the Constitution, subsection 2, the Congress can get rid of a president, can impeach him, if he's considered to be permanently morally incapable of being president, right? No one knows what that means. There's no definition of this. And so it could be used basically without much limitation. And what had happened was that Vizcarra began to face a lot of corruption charges himself. So the most, in September 2020, Congress actually started an impeachment process. So even before November, right? In September 2020, Congress started an impeachment process against Vizcarra on the grounds that he gave corrupt contracts to a former performer known as Richard Swing. He gave $50,000 or so in these opaque contracts, apparently, allegedly. And this was seen as corruption. It was not I don't think many people took this very seriously. the Richard Swing scandal, and the effort fizzled. I mean, they did attempt to actually impeach him, but it didn't go anywhere. So the defeat of the first impeachment attempt against Vizcarra increased his and observers' confidence that he could defeat another impeachment attempt, right? That, like, these people aren't serious, that he's a popular president. There's no mandate, there's no kind of support for a kind of impeachment of him. We were all wrong, right? So actually, I started my job at the EAU just when this was happening, and I remember the discussions, in the news and stuff. Like, everyone thought, oh, it's not gonna succeed this time, this impeachment against Vizcarra. And when it did, I think everyone was surprised. It was shocking, actually, that it happened. I think the difference was that this time, the allegation against Vizcarra was a bit more serious. It was that he was alleged to have accepted 2.3 million soles in coimas, in bribes, right, related to a public works project when he was the governor of the southern region of Moquegua. He was governor of Moquegua between 2011 and 2014 before he became vice president and then president. So the severity of the allegations. Now, of course, these are allegations. There's no proof. He hasn't been convicted of it in any court. But you don't need to be convicted of a crime to be impeached, right? And so it was enough for the vast majority of Congress people to vote against him. The actual vote was 105 to 19. You only need 87 votes to impeach, which is 2/3 of the Congress. So that means that the impeachment of Vizcarra actually had support from, the right wing, the left wing, the center. Most parties supported it. And because of weak party cohesion, you had divisions within parties, right? You had people within parties who voted against it and people voting for it. So it was all over the place. There's only one party that voted consistently against the impeachment, and that was the Partido Morado, which is a center-left party, which is probably the closest to the Democrat Party in the United States I can think of. They voted against it. It's the only party that did consistently. And this created, obviously, a crisis, because who was going to replace him? Well, you have dos semanas de presidentes, right? You have Vizcarra's impeached, and then what follows is, the head of the Speaker of the House then becomes president, because in Peru, the president has two vice presidents. So PPK had two vice presidents. One of them, I believe, resigned, and then you just had Vizcarra. And so you didn't have anybody else behind him from the original PPK election in 2016. So it went to Manuel Merino, who was the Speaker of the House, and he was from Acción Popular, which is the oldest party in Peru that is in Congress. So it is an established party, and its ideology is all over the place. It's center right, center left. It's kind of like Peronismo in some ways, maybe. It's kind of all over the place. But nevertheless, he became president, as you can see here in the second picture here, on November 11th. November 15th, he resigned. Well, why? Because many people in Peru thought that this was a golpe de Estado. This was a coup against democracy. And there was huge protests all over Peru against him. And so he was forced to resign after two people were killed by what was expected to be the police during the protests. And he just could not, he did not have any political legitimacy. After his resignation, you had a couple of days of chaos because no one knew who would take his place, right? So you're really going down the ladder to find somebody. And the crisis of representation was so deep in Peru, like basically everyone voted to impeach him. It was widely agreed, I think, that the next president should have voted against the impeachment, which left only 19 people. That's not a lot of people to choose from. So 9 days after Vizcarra was ousted from power, Francisco Sagasti of the Partido Morado was elected Speaker of the House and thus president, where he's currently ending PPK's original term, right? It's hard to believe when you think back that this is still the term of PPK from 2016, but it is. And so Sagasti is a well-respected, I would say elder statesman. He has a strong background. He has a PhD. He's worked for international organizations, I believe the World Bank, et cetera. So he comes with a lot of gravitas, which I think is what Peru needed at the time. And he's done a very good job, I would say, regarding COVID, right? In terms of the vaccines, his presidency has been fairly good in that. And his popularity now is increasing. I think, there was a period of time where he was unpopular, but now that, the next president's coming and this whole crisis, I think people are beginning to give Sagasti the credit I think he probably deserves. So that's the background, believe it or not, of the whole election. So in this crisis, in this madness, right, people in Peru are looking for an outsider. They want somebody who's different. They want somebody who represents change. They don't like any of the political parties. They think it's all corrupt, basically, and that there's a serious legitimacy crisis in Peru and a serious crisis of representation. But I think the thing that I haven't discussed yet, which is very important, is COVID. And, Peru has suffered immensely from COVID-19. Here's a graph of the declines in GDP in Latin America and South America in particular in 2020. And by far, Peru is the country that suffered the greatest decline, declining by 11% last year. And that's because, Vizcarra, one of the reasons why is because when Vizcarra just imposed a very, very, very strict lockdown, one of the strictest in the world. And that had enormous consequences on Peru's economy. A lot of Peru's economy is dependent on informal labor. 70% of workers are informal in Peru, which is enormous. And they couldn't go out and work. And you also had restrictions on mining, for example. It was just it was a very serious and very robust approach to dealing with the crisis, but it had this enormous economic impact, which isn't shared by any other country in the region, as you can see. So this had a huge impact because it also meant that poverty increased dramatically in Peru. The government has said that poverty increased by 10% in 2020 alone, from I think 20 to around 30%. And that means that a whole decade of progress in reducing poverty in Peru was erased in 1 year. Unemployment went up significantly. Incomes went down significantly. It's a serious social crisis in Peru that I think is not discussed enough because of what's happening at the political level. But underlying the political crisis is this. And people want and demand a greater state, right? This is one of the things. And consistently in polls, you see that people are saying, look, the crisis has been so severe that it's very clear that the Peruvian state needs to do more. And why? Well, here's another reason why. Because Peru has been the worst country in the world when it comes to the number of people who have died from COVID. If you measure it by excess deaths, meaning how many more people died relative to the baseline, right? Relative to how many people normally die. And the number of people who have died in Peru over the baseline is, as you can see here, over 100%, right? Well beyond Ecuador, Nicaragua, any other country in the world. So that just shows you how severe the COVID-19 crisis was in Peru and still is, actually. And this second graph here is actually quite interesting because this is from the Imperial College London, and it shows you you can see here, these lines down here shows you the recorded number of COVID-19 cases per day, right? So it's what the government is able to record with testing, right? And the blue line is what is estimated to be the actual number of COVID-19 infections per day. And you can see they're not even close to being the same thing. So the scale of the COVID-19 crisis in Peru is unprecedented. And I think, again, this has to do in large part with the way that the Peruvian labor market functions. It's a very highly informal labor market where people have to work, right? And you also have a very weak state that doesn't have the kind of welfare benefits like unemployment insurance. Even if it did, the vast majority of Peruvians don't have access to it because they're not formal workers. So it really speaks to a deep-seated structural problem within Peru's economy that then translates into this political and social crisis. So, well, what does this mean? Well, Peruvians were looking for anyone, I think, who's different, who's new. And you can see here two candidates that stand out. So the first one is George Forsyth. You can see at the bottom here. He was leading the polls in December 2020 and January 21. He was a football player, soccer player, very popular, very attractive, tall, very charismatic guy. And so he was, popular. He had high levels of name recognition. Many of these other people didn't, apart probably from Fujimori, De Soto, and Mendoza. But he was, a well-known figure and, again, very charismatic. But as the campaign wore on, he was not a good campaigner. And he was also somebody, I think, who didn't really convince people that he was able to be president. And you can see that his support crashed as the campaign really ramped up. The other candidate who was, we thought actually at the EIU would be actually had the strongest chance of being president actually was Yoni Lescano of Acción Popular. And why is that? Well, Yoni Lescano is an interesting character, right? Because he comes from Puno, which is in the south of Peru. So he's not from the Limeño elite. He's not related to Lima in that way. And he also had Acción Popular behind him, which is, again, the oldest and one of the most established parties in Peru. The problem he faced were a number of things. So number one, he burst onto the scene as a left-wing candidate, actually. The party he was ahead of, Acción Popular, like I said, was like Peronismo, right? It's not exactly left-wing. It's not exactly right-wing. It could go either way. And he was like the left-wing version of the party. And he proposed many things that are similar to what Pedro Castillo proposed, like a constitutional reform. He wanted to increase royalties on mining. He wanted increased public spending on health and education, et cetera. So, but he didn't come with the baggage of being, from an unknown party. And on top of that, he didn't claim he was a communist or a Marxist-Leninist or anything like that, right? He was a populist in a very Peruvian sense. And he was also very socially conservative. So although he was, proposing economically left-wing ideas, his social policies were well within the mainstream of a socially conservative society. And this is something I think should be noted, that none of these candidates, with the exception of Veronica Mendoza, supported what we would consider progressive social policies like same-sex marriage or abortion, things of that nature. They were not in favor of this. And this is not a salient division in Peru as it is maybe in the United States, other parts of Latin America like Argentina, Brazil, right? That Peru is a much more socially conservative society. So Yoni Lescano, I think, had an opportunity to consolidate, but I think the reason that one of the reasons I think he failed to consolidate his support is because his debate performances were actually quite bad. He seemed, I think, a bit unprepared. And as a result, he kind of fizzled in the polls after those debates. On the right, I think what's interesting is the rise of Rafael Lopez Aliaga. As you can see, in December 2020, he was 0.2%. He didn't exist in the polls. And then as the campaign ramped up, his, extreme rhetoric, he was on Willax, which is like the Peruvian equivalent of Fox News, right? He would be there all the time. He had a social media presence. His supporters were very loud. He was taking very controversial positions. And that got him notoriety and support from a certain segment of the population. And so he actually, I never thought that he would actually become president. I never thought that he had a strong chance, but he had a chance. It wasn't zero, right? And so, it was entirely possible to have imagined Aliaga versus Castillo race, which would have been, I think, even more polarizing, believe it or not, than the Fujimori-Castillo race. Hernando de Soto was also another candidate who had high levels of name recognition, but he almost made it. He almost could have gone to the second round. As you can see in the last polls here, he was tied with Keiko Fujimori, but he just I don't know why he wasn't able to consolidate. I don't know the reasoning, but he wasn't. And he lost. And so Keiko Fujimori was the one who had a very strong level of base support. As you can see, she had consistently pretty much around 8% support. And then, she was able to consolidate towards the end. So what actually happened? Well, you can see here what happened. You can see that Keiko Fujimori got 13.4%, and then Pedro Castillo got about 19%. So the two of them together only got about 32% of the vote, which is very low, right? These are the two people who are going to make it to the second round. Together alone, they only got 32% of the vote. Lopez Aliaga was third place with 11.7%, and Avanza País with Hernando de Soto, 11.6%. So it's on the right. Actually, it was very close. It didn't have to be Keiko Fujimori, but she had the built-in advantage of a stronger base and some political organization that the other parties obviously didn't have. What's interesting is that Acción Popular basically collapsed, and Juntos por el Perú of Veronica Mendoza, her party, although it was, I think it got about 18% in 2016, she wasn't able to make the inroads. She did not represent the type of change that Peruvians wanted. They really wanted an outsider. They wanted somebody who was not part of Peru's political past, and she was. And I think Pedro Castillo offered a much more clear, more radical position that was much more easier to understand for a lot of voters. It was an uncompromising vision that reminded you again of like Ollanta Humala of 2006, right? Pedro Castillo was very clear, right, that he was a representative of the interior of the country and represented their interests, and also he was a man of the left, the hard left. So this brings us to Castillo himself. So Castillo, he's an interesting person because his rise in Peruvian politics, never mind becoming president, his rise in politics in Peru was unexpected by everyone, basically. His name, for example, Peru Libre, was not included in many polls until the very end. Highlighting that, for a lot of people, this whole campaign was underneath the radar, that nobody had expected this to go anywhere. So what's important to note is that Castillo was an invited candidate to Peru Libre, meaning that he didn't form part of Peru Libre as an organic member of the party, right? He wasn't a card-carrying member of Peru Libre from the beginning. No, he was an outsider who was invited to become the leader of the party. And the person who invited him was Vladimir Cerrón. And you can see here, this is the strangely, I think kind of strangely cult of personality kind of title of the Peru Libre Manifesto that was actually authored by Cerrón, the one that Castillo originally ran on. Castillo became the presidential candidate. As you can see here, Pedro Castillo lanzó su precandidatura a la presidencia for Peru Libre here in late October 2020. And he accepted this program, and it was fine with him. And the program was a radical left program. We're talking, in the first pages, basically, it says we're a Marxist-Leninist party, right? It's very clear it's a radical left platform. And for that reason, I don't think anyone would have thought that this would have gotten anywhere in Peru. Now, why did Cerrón invite Castillo? Well, Cerrón was actually convicted of corruption in 2019. He was the governor of the region of Junin, and he was convicted of corruption related to, I think, public works corruption or kickbacks there. And so he wasn't able to run. You can't run if you're convicted of a crime. So he invited Castillo to become the presidential candidate. Castillo, well, why Castillo? Well, Castillo is obviously a very charismatic figure. And so who is Castillo? Well, Castillo was a teacher. He got his degree in teaching in the 90s. And he ran once for office in the early 2000s for the Perú Posible, which was the party of Alejandro Toledo, which is the first president after Fujimori, which is a center-left party, wasn't, deeply ideological, but he ran for mayor and lost. But so that was his only attempt at politics before this. So how, why did he emerge to be the candidate? Well, one of the reasons he emerged is because he became a charismatic leader of the teachers' union's protest against PPK in 2017. So there was a protest against education reform that PPK had proposed. And this created like a 2-month-long protest by the teachers against PPK. And one of the major leaders was Pedro Castillo. It would be kind of like Hugo Mochano, right? Like you can imagine a similar character, right? Or Oscar Andrade, kind of, very charismatic, very radical left-wing positions, very combative. And what actually happened was like they kind of won that strike. And that, made Castillo a household name for many Peruvians. But after that strike, he kind of receded into the background, right? He didn't consolidate. He didn't turn that into any political vehicle. He didn't do anything like that. But he was a known character, right? So inviting him on to be the candidate was interesting. I don't think many people thought that would happen, but it did. And what Castillo brought on board was this relationship with the teachers' unions. He had an infrastructure behind him that I think was important, that would become important actually to explain part of the reason why he was successful in the first round, at least. So going back to the manifesto, Perú Libre from Cerón, what did they want, right? Like, why was it such a radical program? Well, again, it's admittedly a Marxist-Leninist party. Its proposals included nationalizing portions of Peru's economy, including the mining sector, withdrawing Peru from its free trade agreements, withdrawing Peru even from international human rights treaties. Makes you think, like, why were they thinking ahead? Like, if we're going to implement a radical socialist program, we realize that these international treaties would become a problem for us. It's a really strange thing to read, actually, because it's kind of foreshadowing what a radical left program would look like. Especially if you read one part about agriculture. I think if you have the time, read that document. It's very strange and interesting because it foreshadows, I think, what they think may have happened if they had actually implemented a radical left program. But the core of the program itself was the rewriting the 1993 Fujimori era constitution. This was the crux of the campaign, right? Like, the constitution of 1993 is illegitimate. And that's because it comes from the Fujimori era. And we have to get rid of it. We have to create a new constitution. We have to refound Peru by changing the parts of the constitution that are very favorable to the private sector, right? The economic chapter, it's called. They really wanted to get rid of that because they want to reshape Peru's economy. This was obviously, a big, big, big challenge and a big threat to Peru's economic order. There's no other party that came as radical as this, right? This is as far left as you got in Peru. So the thing is that notably, I think partly because of how radical it was, Castillo's candidacy was not taken seriously by the Limeño press, right? No one took this serious. No one was paying attention. I remember no one ever mentioned his name. He also, what's interesting is that, like, he didn't have a serious social media presence. Like, he wasn't on Twitter, like Facebook was not really, like, his growing popularity was not therefore perceived by most people. And the normal mechanisms, right, which is the media, social media, I think the normal metrics to measure this. Castillo's approach to campaigning actually was to flout the COVID-19 restrictions on in-person campaigning. He actually campaigned in person throughout the interior of the country. He didn't go to Lima. He went to the interior. He campaigned there. He talked to, the people in, pueblos all throughout Peru, little towns. And he relied on his networks with the teachers' unions, et cetera, to spread the word around in the interior and to mobilize support that way. So it was a very traditional campaign, actually. But what is notable is kind of like, what's notable is that he did this in a way, sorry, one second. he did this in a way that allowed him to consolidate his support. Sorry, I just had a warning about battery. But anyway, he did this in a way that mobilized his support in a traditional way that I think was not perceived well by other people. And that's interesting because what's interesting about this is that he actually got COVID-19. He got coronavirus during his campaigning, right? So he actually survived COVID, which is an interesting side note. So, you know, as Yanni Lescano's popularity crashed, right? As I stated, he did not have the support that he needed in the interior as he once did. Castillo took up the mantle of the interior's interests and, you know, became the front runner. And so only in those very final weeks did it actually happen that Castillo was able to get the media attention. And there is when things really began to go a little bit sideways because he was not experienced. He's not an experienced politician. And, you know, at the time he was still supportive of Perú Libre's campaign, you know, the manifesto, the radical manifesto. And he was going out there saying, I'm going to get rid of the constitutional court and I'm going to nationalize it. And so he was really scaring, I think, a lot of people that this, you know, who is this person and how is it possible he can become president? So he won the first round, and there you had this, you know, explosion of lack of belief. I think a lot of people did not know what was going on. There was this person, it was surprising to him. And so what he was aware that he needed to go to the center to win in the second round. Castillo could not maintain this radical left position. He couldn't do this and win. So he began to moderate his message and policies throughout the second round of the campaign. And it was with fits and starts, right? He would still say like, oh, I'm going to ban imports, right? This was, I think was just coming out. He didn't really think through what he was saying. And over time, right, he spoke less. And he didn't go to the debates that Keiko Fujimori wanted him to go to. He had to consolidate his support and his messaging. And the turning point for him, I think, was when he actually got into an agreement with Veronica Mendoza, as you can see here, this photo, because what she did is that she brought onto Perú Libre a established and well, how can I put it, like a strong team behind her of technocrats who knew how to actually organize a campaign and knew what they needed to do to actually provide a left-wing alternative, but wasn't going to radically alter Peru's economic matrix, its economic institutions. And so this created Perú al Bicentenario sin corrupción, right? This is the replacement basically of the Cerón campaign, which was a lot more moderate, which talked about, I think, much more social democratic reforms, increasing taxes for sure, but not nationalizing anything. That phraseology was gone. No more Marxist-Leninism, that was gone. So he moderated significantly. And as a result, you know, I think the types of policies that Castillo is proposing is kind of closer to what Veronica Mendoza was proposing than what Cerón was proposing. So, but the question again is, you know, la izquierda peruana, like what is it? You know, that's a big question mark, and it's not clear where it's actually going to be heading. Sorry. So what happened on the right? La derecha cerrando filas, right? So basically, oh my God, this is a nightmare. This is scary, right? Fujimori is our only hope to stop communism, right? This was from a lot of people on the right. Now, this was something that Fujimori herself promoted, right? That she was like, I'm the only bulwark against communism. And this was interesting because Fujimori was by far the most unpopular politician in Peru. You know, she would almost certainly have lost to any other candidate in the second round. She did not have popular support. And the only way she could actually win is if she was against like the most radical left person you can imagine. And just happened to be that that's how it ended up, right? And Castillo's radical left position was actually ideal for her. It was the most favorable conditions that she had to win the presidency. And she got lots of support from the political establishment because they were also afraid of Castillo. They didn't know how radical he would be. And so they, you know, mobilized around Keiko Fujimori. The most famous example of this actually was Mario Vargas Llosa, who, you know, went all in on Keiko Fujimori. Remember, he fought against Alberto Fujimori in 1990 and lost, and he became a strident anti-Fujimorista. But, you know, he thought that the threat from Castillo and Cerón was so great that, you know, anything was better than that, including Keiko Fujimori. And to this day, he's very much supportive of Keiko Fujimori, which is interesting. And then you have other parties like, you know, the center-right party, APP here, Cesar Cunha, who said, I'm supporting Keiko Fujimori in a second round. So she was able to get a lot of support from a number of sources. But it wasn't enough, right? Like you couldn't win by scaring voters that communism is coming and they're the only bulwark, because not all voters are afraid of communism the way you think they are. Another thing is that, you know, a lot of people thought it was cynical. But the other thing is that the anti-communist message had clear limits because a significant portion of the Peruvian electorate today no longer has a living memory of Sendero Luminoso. They don't understand, you know, the threat that the far left would present in Peru, you know, the way that she imagines it. So it wasn't it didn't have the similar kind of mobilizing power it used to. And so aware of that, she began to offer populist spending proposals that were actually targeted to the voters who would have voted for Castillo in the interior. For example, I think the most important one was to redistribute 40% of the canon minero to individuals through cash transfers, right? That's a significant boost to people's incomes in the interior. So she was trying her best. She was trying to, you know, provide populist, you know, alternatives for these voters, but it didn't work ultimately. Now it did work and didn't work. So you can see here in this graph that, you know, she went from a massive deficit against Castillo to basically coming within 0.2% or 0.4% of losing to Castillo. That's huge. And I think her ability to mobilize and scare voters on the center and the right helped. But then you had this additional populist, you know, proposals that I think helped shore up some of the vote. But ultimately, it wasn't enough. She lost, as we all know. So this is now where we are now. Is this a crisis without, you know, an exit? Una crisis sin salida. This is a big question mark. So what's interesting is that the result was so close that it was expected that whoever would have lost would seek a recount at least. But Fujimori actually went further than that. The day following the vote, she alleged that there was widespread fraud in the election. And the following day, she said that there was widespread fraud. And then a couple of days later, she was saying, I want to annul, or I want to like basically, get rid of 800 polling places that represent up to 200,000 voters. And most of those polling places were obviously in places that voted for Pedro Castillo. Now, that didn't. She put those to the Electoral Commission for them to review. The electoral authorities only considered a partial number of them because she wasn't able to get all of those petitions in time. And they've all been rejected. None of them have been accepted to be legitimate. So as more and more of these were rejected, time was running out for Keiko, and Luis Arce Cordova, who was one of the judges on the Electoral Commission, suddenly resigned, saying that, you know, the board was had a clear political bias against Keiko Fujimori, basically. And so this had the effect of stalling their process even further. And so, again, this is important because as long as you cannot pronounce the winner of the election, then you can't actually have the announcement. You can't actually do the transition to the new government, which weakens Castillo's presidency significantly because he can't actually get a cabinet in order. He can't actually negotiate with the government. And again, Castillo is still not proclaimed president of Peru. I think this is very important to keep in mind. Now, the thing is that another judge was then put in place to replace Cordova, but he only very recently actually signed off on the petitions, and so only now has the electoral authority said we're going to declare president on July 20th, only 8 days before Castillo's actually sworn in as president. So you have a transition that should have lasted about 2 months to 8 days, right? So this is a huge risk factor for governability in Peru, especially at this moment in time when the vaccination is so important for Peru's economic and just actual physical health. So Fujimori said that she's not going to recognize the results, right? She says that this is a stolen election and that she's going to resist as much as she can. And you would think, okay, well, you know, like, of course she's going to say that. But what's interesting is that like Mario Vargas supports her in this. It's not like this is it's not like no one supports Keiko. There is a significant number of people who still believe that this is the case, and powerful people too, not just Keiko supporters. So this is a bad omen, I think, for democracy in Peru, because you're going to have at least a quarter or a third of the country that is convinced that the election was stolen, and that they are going to do everything in their power to, again, undermine the Castillo presidency. We've seen this before. It's probably going to happen again. The difference is that Fujimori's hand is much weaker than it was in 2016, when she commanded a large majority in Congress. She doesn't have that majority anymore. She still has influence in Fuerza Popular. Obviously, it's her party. But any opposition to Castillo will have to create this. So Fujimori can likely count on the support of Rafael Lopez Aliaga to complicate things, but I don't think it's going to be enough. We're going to have to wait and see how they're going to try to undermine the Castillo administration, but I think it's pretty much a given that they're going to try. But there's complication on the left too with Castillo, right? I don't think anybody really knows what's going on. So Castillo is all but certain to become president, but he faces enormous challenges in governance. The first challenge is that the delay in the transition from the Sagasti administration has made it impossible to coordinate policies, right? And next government will likely not have a full grasp on the governance challenges ahead. If you only have 8 days to transition, you really can't get much information from the current government about the state of the economy, the state of the vaccination program, et cetera. So my hope would be that they would maintain many of the key positions underneath the ministerial positions to allow a more gradual transition instead of just boom, changing everybody, because that would be a bit chaotic in terms of governance. But we'll see. I mean, Castillo is not experienced in governance. This is one of the major risks. Remember, he's not a politician. He doesn't have this experience. The other thing is, we don't know whose cabinet is. He still has not said anybody he still has not named anybody, for his cabinet. This is a major risk. We don't know who's going to be in there. We don't know what the policies they're going to be implementing. And we're only a couple of weeks from the actual transition. This is unprecedented. So the uncertainty is at maximum in Peru. Sorry. So what's stopping the announcement of the cabinet? Not sure, right? It could be a tactic to not reveal your cards, but I think it speaks closer to a deeper division within Perú Libre between the Cerón wing, the left wing of the party, and the more center-left wing from Veronica Mendoza. So I think that is probably what's happening to some degree. There's some positions in there that have to be negotiated. So it is widely expected that Pedro Franque will be Castillo's economy minister. Now, he's a former World Bank economist and advisor to Veronica Mendoza. He has become the voice of Castillo on economic matters and has signaled to investors that Peru will maintain its macroeconomic orthodoxy, right? So nothing there is going to change. Okay, well, we'll see. He still has to be named economy minister. And Castillo also said, as you can see here in this tweet, that he wants Julio Velarde to remain the head of the Banco Central de Peru. Now, that's a big signal that, hey, look, monetary policy is going to remain orthodox. I'm not going to change everything. So you went from the most radical left platform to what you're seeing today with Castillo. I think he's becoming aware that he can't just do whatever he wants in presidency, and that there are serious limitations to presidential power. Now, this is a clear repudiation of the radical left. However, that faces another problem. Well, if you repudiate that economic platform, then you're going to have to compensate it some other way. So following these announcements of economic pragmatism, he shifted back to say that he would ask Congress to initiate the process to install a constituent assembly to rewrite Peru's constitution. And this is the screenshot here. So this now goes back to the left, right? So he has to compensate, I think, he may actually believe this is necessary. This may be something he actually believes as well that he wants to do, right? He was elected on a platform to change the Constitution. He's going to try to do it. How sincere is he in that? I don't know. I think he knows that he doesn't have the congressional support to actually do this. And it's not even clear if it's even legal to do a constituent assembly in Peru. Or if it is, it's very complicated. What's important here to remember is that Castillo is an invited presidential candidate to Perú Libre. He doesn't have the organic links to the party. Cerón does. And Cerón is the one who's widely recognized to be in charge of the congressional list, that the party is his. And so if Castillo wants to govern, he still needs to address Cerón and his interests. And I think this picture in the middle is highly representative of that. So it's not entirely clear where this party is going. And I think, again, the big problem here is a lot of improvisation by Castillo because, again, he doesn't have a strong political background. So another sign that Castillo is maintaining hard left positions includes his support of the Cuban regime. I think recently we just saw that Castillo said that he's blaming the U.S. embargo. He didn't even talk about the protesters, their demands against the regime and the dictatorship in Cuba, which echoes like, AMLO, echoes Alberto Fernandez. So you're going to see a realignment of Peru's foreign policy on a much more hard left positioning than it has been traditionally, which could cause problems actually with the United States and Brazil, under Bolsonaro at least. We'll see. So the biggest challenge for Castillo going forward is the vaccination program. It's speeding up in Peru, but it's still far behind other countries in the region, especially like Uruguay and Chile. As a result, Peru is actually very susceptible to a third wave of the COVID-19 Delta variant. And it remains unclear what a Castillo administration would do to stem a third wave. This is a big, who knows? No one knows. A third wave seems almost inevitable, unfortunately. But we don't know what that political implication of that will be. So I think this is for, I know much of my audience is Uruguaya too. So, what is the left able to give Castillo from other parts of the region? Well, I think there was this really interesting interview between Pepe Mujica and Pedro Castillo. And, Mujica told him, like, first, don't fall into an authoritarian trap, right? Don't think that you have all the answers. This is in this quote here. Be able to recognize your failures. Now, I don't know if Uruguayos think that Mujica was that, honest when he was in power, but nevertheless, he's saying, don't think that you're the owner of the truth, basically. And I think that is a tendency on the far left that does exist. And he's trying to say, don't get into that trap. The other thing I think is also super important is that recognizing the role of the market in the economy, that the role of the state is to regulate the market. It is to redistribute the surplus created by the market, but not to get rid of the market. And I think this is a lesson that Mujica is giving Castillo, because in order for the left to succeed, it needs to maintain a climate favorable to investment, right? It needs to maintain a pro-growth strategy, because without growth, you can't redistribute. Or if you do, it comes at the cost of growth, and that creates even more problems, as we see in Venezuela and Cuba and all these other countries. So this is, I think, the lessons that Mujica is giving Castillo. On the right, well, this is another problem, right? It's un futuro incierto, right? We don't know what the reaction of Keiko Fujimori is going to be, but it seems to follow a pattern. Anne Applebaum had a recent article on democracy is surprisingly easy to undermine, and this idea of elections are fraudulent and things of that nature. This is a tactic that's used by right-wing parties now globally, in Israel, United States, Peru now. And Bolsonaro has already signaled that he's not even going to have the election if the elections aren't clean. I mean, it's already in your face that this is already something going to happen. And then you have Keiko Fujimori, who says that she's not going to recognize the results of the election, right? So this is a major risk factor, I think, for everyone in the country and in the world. I think it's something to be very wary of, that we do face a problem here in terms of undermining democracy. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and listening to it. I might actually have to change my computer because I'm running low on battery. So if you can give me maybe 1 minute, I will be back. Is that okay?
Yep, no problem at all, Nicolás. Go ahead. Bien, bien, bien. Muchas gracias. Le agradecemos a Nicolás por la presentación, que fue muy interesante, con mucha información y realmente nos acerca a la realidad política del Perú, que para muchos puede ser una realidad un poco lejana, pero que tiene un impacto en el resto del continente. Mi primera reflexión, y ya mientras esperamos que se sume Nicolás, es que tengamos en cuenta de que tal vez, más allá de las características peculiares que pueda tener el sistema político peruano, lo que aquí estamos viendo con la aparición de un outsider con tanta fuerza, sea una de las primeras consecuencias significativas que el COVID va a tener en América Latina. Es decir, el COVID va a tener consecuencias políticas en América Latina. El COVID va a tener. Tal vez desde Uruguay nos cuesta visualizar eso, siendo que tenemos un presidente con una aprobación en el entorno del 60%, con un buen manejo de la pandemia desde el punto de vista de la vacunación y del año que prácticamente no tuvimos consecuencias, pero esta no, de vuelta, como siempre decimos en clase, no se puede analizar el resto del mundo con una visión desde el Uruguay. No podemos analizar lo que ha sido el impacto del COVID, especialmente en la región del mundo con el mayor impacto en cantidad de muertos y desde el punto de vista del impacto económico, con una visión desde el Uruguay. Y probablemente lo que tal vez estemos viendo aquí en el caso peruano sea algo que pueda tener consecuencias en el resto de la región en los próximos meses y años. Pensemos que se nos vienen por adelante elecciones en Chile, que se nos vienen por adelante elecciones de medio término en la Argentina, que se nos vienen no tan lejos elecciones en Brasil el año que viene. Es decir, esto va a tener consecuencias lamentablemente por el impacto y la gravedad del COVID en nuestra región, y ni que hablar de América Central y del Caribe, ¿no? Es decir, lo que estamos viviendo, la explosión que estamos viviendo en Cuba, la llama, el detonante, claramente es la consecuencia del COVID por el impacto que tiene en la economía cubana, la imposibilidad de recibir el turismo, ¿no? Y las divisas, etcétera, etcétera. Así que, Nicolás, yo simplemente lo que estaba diciendo es agradeciéndote por esta muy buena presentación que nos acerca al Uruguay, una realidad muy lejana, muy diferente a la que tenemos nosotros, con un sistema de partidos políticos súper consolidados, con partidos políticos que están rumbo a cumplir los 200 años de vida y existencia y funcionamiento pleno, en el caso del Partido Colorado y el Partido Nacional, y en el caso del Frente Amplio, ya llegando a los 50 años de vida y existencia. O sea, son realidades políticas absolutamente diferentes e incomparables, la peruana con la uruguaya. Y con esto abro, sé que estamos muy pasados de tiempo, pero si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, podemos tomar una pregunta como para cerrar esta muy buena presentación de hoy. Pedro, o Sayan. Vamos con le damos la mano, le damos a Sayan. Sayan, adelante.
Gracias. Tengo una pregunta un poco bastante general, que es, usted nos está trayendo al final de la presentación la realidad de cómo se empieza a ver muchos políticos alegando, cuando pierden las elecciones claramente, que las elecciones han sido trucadas, que no son legítimas, y de este modo también vemos el daño a la democracia. Cada vez vemos esto con mayor presentación. ¿Va a ser un gran problema a futuro? ¿Y qué herramientas cree usted que van a tener los regímenes democráticos para poder defenderse?
Muy buena pregunta. Sí, creo que va a ser un problema, porque es una manera de poder ahora, es una manera para mantener el poder, es una manera para asegurar que ellos que pierden no pierden la elección, que ellos piensan realmente que ganaron. Ellos piensan realmente que ganaron. Algunos de ellos realmente piensan eso. Y es muy difícil para decir, porque ¿qué va a pasar ahora en Perú? Es que seguramente Castillo va a ser proclamado presidente. pero la resistencia en contra de Castillo ahora va a ser muy, muy fuerte, podemos decir. Acá en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, con Trump y los apoyantes de él, vemos la misma cosa, que ellos no conocen todavía que él perdió la elección. Y eso tienen ahora en los estados, acá en Estados Unidos, muchas leyes ahora que están en concurso para restringir la manera de que la gente puede votar. Y eso pienso que en otros países están viendo lo que está pasando acá en Estados Unidos, en cómo restringir el número de votantes en elecciones futuras. Y eso es obviamente muy dañoso en contra de la democracia, porque no debemos restringir, debemos ampliar el número de personas que pueden votar, ¿no? Al mismo tiempo, una manera legal y una manera en que es legítimo. Eso es el tema. El tema para mí es cualquier tipo de reforma electoral que puede pasar en los países necesita el apoyo del gran número de partidos de izquierda y derecha. Por supuesto, va a tener personas en la izquierda dura, izquierda derecha, que no apoyan eso. Pero si tiene el centro apoyando reformas electorales, está bien. Si hay el centro derecha, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos, en Israel y otros países que no apoyan eso, eso es creando un sistema electoral politizado, ¿no? Que el sistema ahora es politizado. Que la cosa que normalmente la gente piensa, bueno, es una institución neutro que no tiene opiniones, ahora es transformado en una institución político. Y ahora el ámbito de la política ahora entra en la elección. Y eso es muy dañoso para todos. Y veremos qué pasa. Vemos ejemplos, por ejemplo, en Venezuela. Esto pasó en Venezuela. No es una cosa solamente de derecha. La derecha ahora está en la ofensiva en esto, ¿no? Pero esto pasó en Nicaragua, esto pasó en Venezuela, esto pasó en otros países populistas de izquierda, también en América Latina. Entonces, esto es un desastre para todos, porque cuando cambias el sistema electoral de un país, es muy difícil cambiarlo otra vez, ¿no? Es a competitive authoritarian regime, como se llama. En Levitsky se llama el competitive authoritarian regime. Y eso está, creo, en muchos países, poco a poco, están creando eso, ¿no? Y ahora la batalla entre izquierda y derecha es sobre estas reglas básicas de la democracia. Y eso es muy dañoso para todos.
Bien, clarísimo, clarísimo. Bueno, estamos terminando. Nicolás, te agradecemos mucho por tu tiempo. Le agradecemos a Sescos por el apoyo en la organización de esta conferencia. Y por supuesto también agradecemos a todos los que nos acompañaron, que han sido prácticamente todos. Tenemos un poco más de 90, tenemos 80 en este momento. Le agradecemos todos nosotros a Nicolás por tu tiempo y nos estaremos viendo pronto. Así que muchas gracias, Nicolás.
Gracias.
Gracias. Saludos.